Anyway, so next up, we have someone that I really resonate with as I myself working in the crypto space. Let's welcome Brian Behlendorf, Executive Director of the Hyperledger project as part of the Linux Foundation. Thank you so much to the panelists. And yeah, I think Brian.
Thank you. Take care.
You should be on.
Bye, Brian.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Hello? Yes, awesome.
And can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, great. Well, thank you so much, Alex. That was a really fun panel to listen in on. And thank you to Sebastian as well for the invitation to speak to all of you. I thought today I would try to talk about the impact that, well, not only the impact, but the role for open source software and blockchain technology can play in the fight against COVID and adapting to this new reality. So Alex and Sebastian, I presume I just go forward and talk, and then we kind of open it up for Q&A.
Sure, yeah, that format totally works. Go on.
Okay, great. So, and welcome to San Francisco. I thought I would just kind of have a more interesting background than my normal kind of work life. So let me just try to set the stage a little bit, which I know a lot of this conference has been about kind of talking about this new reality. But to set the stage just a bit, even walking into this, even before a lot of this exploded, we've been dealing with a crisis of trust in society. There's a marketing firm called Edelman, who for the last 25 years have been running something called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a survey to try to look at, who are all of the different, how much do consumers and businesses trust institutions, trust professions like lawyers and doctors, trust brands, like Coca-Cola and Apple, right? And just trust that society will be there for them. And that barometer had been tracking to very much abysmal lows for those last 25 years. That basically, as a society, we're not sure how to believe what we're told. We're not sure who to turn to when things seem uncertain or bleak. And even in brands, that trust has been affected, right? Even in such stalwart kind of companies like Apple and Google, there's been that gap in trust. And that's made it hard to figure out, how do we listen to our political leaders when they say certain things? We've certainly seen in the United States a much greater reliance upon mayors and upon state politicians to show leadership on when to shut down and how things will be reopened, that sort of thing. And so we're seeing a lot of society kind of bifurcate and try to look for kind of local sources of leadership, right? We're also seeing a lot of concern about, and even again before COVID, we were seeing a lot of mistrust of the kind of centralization that was happening in the tech sector. Centralization to kind of the big cloud providers, centralization, new forms of centralization, such as the rise of Uber, for example. Certainly a lot of that drive to centralization and drive to kind of big infrastructure was something that venture capital really loved. Everyone wanted to be the Uber of this category or that category. But I think a lot of the news and a lot of the concern publicly had been about how that concentrates power and concentrates wealth and concentrates a lot of the engines of a healthy economy, right? Healthy economies are made up of lots and lots of entities that compete, but also work together under common kind of rules, right? And so into this context, adding this tragedy like COVID-19 only kind of amplifies these further. And it might have been okay to deal with these when times were flush, when people were kind of making good money, when there were a lot of free services being offered. But there was a disturbing report some of you might have seen yesterday where even Google said, look, their ad revenue, which drives so many of the free services available online, has taken a big hit in March. No surprise, right? A lot of that is based on consumer spending, on retail, on travel, on the kinds of sectors that are going to be worst hit. So even the tech sector is not going to be, immune, bad pun, to some of these hits, right? And it opens questions like, some of the things we take for granted being free, like Google Docs, which we all depend upon perhaps more than we should. Will that continue to be available for free? And so Open source software has always tended to kind of flourish in these difficult times. I mean, this is perhaps my third kind of recession, or fourth-ish. Certainly 2001 was a moment when a lot of the flush times of the first kind of dot-com boom settled out, and while you had a lot of companies consolidate and collapse, and a lot of the investment kind of pull back, you did see a lot of growth towards open source software happening at that time. That's when certain tools, the use of Apache obviously was well established before then. Linux was starting to be a phenomenon in the enterprise before then. But the early 2000s was really when open source software as an underlying paradigm, especially critical to businesses, took hold, right? Where in 99, 2000, it was kind of freaky, the fact that there were big companies using Linux and Apache. But shortly thereafter, it became the bedrock of how Google built its infrastructure, of how Facebook built its infrastructure, but also at a very retail level about how so many companies revamped how their IT infrastructures worked and their approach to technologies, to developing technology. And I should have actually started with a bit of an intro. For those of you who don't know, Brian Bellendorf, I'm executive director of Hyperledger. We are a non-profit consortium focused on the development of enterprise blockchain technologies, really at the heart of all sorts of use cases around supply chain traceability, trade finance, digital identity. I'll get into many of those in a second. But the Linux Foundation, which got its start in kind of that stew of kind of the 2000 crisis, the 2001, 2002 financial crisis, it started as an organization to try to coordinate the enterprise interest in open source software, particularly the Linux kernel, where there was a real need to find a route for the Linux operating system to grow and become a force in industry without it becoming trapped by a single vendor, right? Or the exclusive domain of, be it Red Hat, be it IBM that was growing at that time, be it Canonical or others. All of those companies needed a way to grow their businesses, especially coming out of that crisis, but do it in a way that didn't confer all those benefits to a single winner, right? To a winner-take-all phenomenon. If you did that, you would end up not actually raising the floor on the capabilities of the tech sector the way that Linux as an operating system really could. And obviously, there were other projects in the open source world that started to grow at the time. I mentioned Apache. I was a co-founder on that. That grew as a phenomenon, as an economic, commercial phenomenon, even a bit before that crisis, but just took off from that point. And not just around web server technology, but also around big data, around increasingly these days machine learning, but also into like Office suite tools and that sort of thing. And the phenomenon coming out of that crisis, and even the 2007, 2008 crisis around, really was about the industry, I think, recognizing that critical foundational role that open source software can play, and really a capacity building role. It wasn't just about, here's good software that lots of people can use and build on top of, like it's a black box, but about how open source software at its heart, with the transparency in the code, the visibility to how it's being built, the ability to modify it and adapt it to different needs. I don't think you would have had a Google or a Facebook or an Uber or any of these others without open source software emerging. And lots of studies have been done about this. I think the number is roughly on the average enterprise software product, on something on the order of 85% of that code is pre-existing open source code that has been adapted, integrated, built, with the remaining 15% being about competitive differentiation for that product, right? On consumer products and hardware, it obviously varies. Even Apple iPhones, though, have a ton of open source software inside them. Android, as everyone knows, has an open source underpinning. None of this is to say that open source is the only way to build software. If anything, it depends, I think, on companies adding value on top of it, on the periphery of it, to get this economic engine going where companies work together on the common bits and then are able to optimize their R&D spending on the proprietary bits, right? Just enough in the common to make it actually work as an ecosystem, but then spending perhaps even more on the differentiated functionality at a higher level of the stack, right? And that's now a pretty well-honed model for how to build not just open source software, but ecosystems of mutual support that create these engines, right? And that's been the Linux Foundation's MO for since its inception, certainly around the Linux kernel and the Linux operating system, and then starting about 8 years ago, expanding into adjacent technology domains in cloud computing, software-defined networking, blockchain technology like with Hyperledger, but also into different verticals. Automotive-grade Linux is now at the heart of the vehicle software sitting inside vehicles from Toyota and Daimler, and it's actually a collaboration with hundreds of other tier 1 and 2 suppliers. And we've recently launched other vertical initiatives in the film industry, in artificial intelligence, and all these other kind of domains that are realizing where the companies in those domains are realizing where they have common cause, where there's common technology challenges, we might as well work together, again, to optimize spend. And it's almost like the same drive to adopt open standards, but now elevated to talk about common code that might implement those standards, but gets everybody further faster, right? So back to COVID-19. In this world of both collapsing trust, but also a world that is increasingly comfortable with the idea of open source software, it was actually no surprise to see this very early on in the crisis in Italy, a group of people get together and say, you know, there's a critical need for PPEs to fight this crisis, for protective gear. There's some of those that can actually be made by 3D printers. Let's work together on kind of the headband protection and other gear. And most interestingly, in a certain kind of valve for ventilators that cost a whole lot of money, where the design of this was pretty simple. It was a way to turn one ventilator into multiple ventilators, so it could be shared amongst a group of people in a clinic, in an emergency room, in an ICU, and it was something that would cost hundreds of dollars and be backlogged, and if you tried to buy it, but could be easily printed on a 3D printer. That group, without asking for anyone's permission, without needing, you know, kind of a top-down kind of approval process or RFP, they went design this ventilator part and shared those designs online. And those designs were iterated upon. They were improved. There's actually a GitHub repository hosting that as well. And to see that kind of ground level innovation come up, it was great. And it was something that where people didn't care about credit, they didn't care about licensing the IP, they didn't care about trying to control it. They said this is critical to get out there and share it. Shortly thereafter, we started to see lots of people building open source projects and open source APIs around trying to organize access to the information about emerging caseloads, right? Because every country, every health authority in different states in the United States and elsewhere that was keeping track of where there were cases, where there were deaths, you know, started to have different ways of sharing that data, and it got super complicated. And people started to build APIs to be able to make querying those data sets faster, to be able to tie those data sets together. And now, if you go and you search open source COVID-19 APIs, you'll get lists of dozens of these that have proven instrumental in trying to wire them up into overlay dashboards that you'd see, you know, in some of the you know, on CNN and on BBC and on kind of news websites. Those the people building those charts, those researchers draw upon those underlying data sources, and a lot of that is using open source software to coordinate that. And then even in some very kind of specific areas too, like there's an open source project called Chime, the COVID-19 COVID-19 hospital impact model for epidemics, something that UPenn put together, which is a way for hospital administrators and health authorities to try to anticipate, given all this data, what is the impact going to be on capacities at hospitals, given beds, given ventilators, given ICU units. How do we anticipate for that? And it allowed for just a real fan out of trying to understand the pandemic and understand where it was heading. And a lot of this, it just brings to the front kind of the things that I think open source is really good at in these fights. It's good at resiliency, right? Having to worry about whether central actors are going to deliver on their promises is something none of us want to be in a position to when people are dying around us. And open source software and open source creative culture and kind of the maker culture says we have to be self-sufficient. We have to be able to build the things that our lives depend upon. The cloud is nice, but the cloud isn't going to fix my problems if they don't have an API for it already, right? I've got to take hold of this and do it. You've seen other people start to say, you know, maybe this is the basis for figuring out how to do certain public-private partnerships. The Chime health model is one example of that. It's been interesting to see some of the folks responding to security holes in Zoom by talking about some of the open source alternatives to Zoom out there, such as something called Jitsi, something called Big Blue Button. These are longstanding efforts to do virtual hosting that are starting to see a tremendous amount, not only of developer interest, but people also concerned about privacy and security issues that have been plaguing Zoom and the other teleconferencing systems. And companies starting to say, well, maybe there's a support and services model around these open source video conferencing tools that might be worth exploring. I think it's also going to be a path out from some of the more advanced kinds of use cases people are thinking about for this fight. So one example that I mean is, so you perhaps have heard of the Google and Apple exposure notification API, right? This system that where if you have a phone that supports Bluetooth Low Energy, if you're running an app that's authorized by Apple or Google to talk to these APIs, the operating system will keep track of, well, basically transmit beacons, numbers that you know, leave kind of a digital trail of where you've been. You'll also record the ones that have been heard around you, and that can be used in a contact tracing paradigm to try to notify people who might have been exposed to somebody who has recently tested positive for COVID-19. There's huge concerns, rightfully so, about privacy and security in such a system. I think Apple and Google have designed a mechanism that actually avoids a central collection of all that data. The problem is the apps that talk to those APIs, they themselves might be at risk, right? So there could be a need for an open source app that talks and sits on top of those APIs, where the software behind that app is something that is standardized across health authorities, where there's scrutiny to make sure that app isn't revealing data it shouldn't be revealing without the end user consent for the sharing of that data. That's the key thing, is where does that end user consent come from? It's a way also for the public to address their concerns about the centralization and the privacy risks of having that data available just to Google and Apple. Having an open source app running on top of that is a way of trying to help keep that whole system honest. So there's a bunch of conversations along those lines that between technology companies, private health authorities, and others, where open source might actually be a path to addressing these very real privacy concerns, but also trust concerns that they and the public would have about how these systems would operate. Shifting gears just to talk about blockchain technology, and in particular enterprise blockchain technology. And I've spent most of the last 4 years kind of immersed, not so much in the crypto side of the blockchain space, but in the enterprise deployments of blockchain. Not that they are opposed to each other or two wholly separate worlds. In fact, there's been a lot recently to bring the world of Ethereum technologies, smart contract technologies, and kind of where Ethereum's going with its 2.0 platform into the world of enterprise blockchain technology, and try to represent this more as a spectrum from permissioned and perhaps private to fully public. But the use cases that have been pioneered over on this side, as I mentioned, have been very much around supply chain traceability, around trade finance and other types of financial applications that map to how the systems of the world work, only trying to make them not only more efficient, but more transparent, more auditable, more easily auditable, I should say. And then also have really emerged in this kind of digital identity space as a way to try to move us away from kind of a central server view of how digital identity works, you know, that your identity is tied to your Facebook account or your Google account or your Apple ID, and instead to something that's more about kind of certificates and badges and things that you hold in a wallet, very much like you might hold your cryptocurrencies in a wallet, but then can present the way that you're used to presenting in the real world. You know, your driver's license, your passport, your diploma, but other identity documents as well. And so already before COVID-19, lots of progress has been made along and deployment into production for these kinds of use cases that have now come to fore. So as an example, there was a launch of something called the IBM Rapid Supplier Connect, which is a network they've stood up, but involves a lot of the companies in the medical supply chain, providing PPEs, providing test results, providing all sorts of supply chain critical needs in the fight against COVID-19. And there the point is to provide and a number, not only in terms of automation of a lot of the points of the supply chain, but really the validation of who the companies are who are providing these services. There's been a lot of fraud in the procurement of PPEs and face masks and that sort of thing. A lot of parties having to do business who've never met each other. There's an article today about the state of New York sending $69 million to somebody in California to buy a bunch of ventilators, and without any kind of clear kind of background or clearance and no delivery of those ventilators yet. And imagine that now happening across international borders, that sort of thing. So international trade depends very much upon knowing the parties you're doing business with and having an agreed upon set of rules to work. And so the deployment of this and other networks out there to address these needs, I think, is an incredibly powerful kind of way to apply it. There's also been some folks looking at using this new approach to digital identity to potentially address the interest that's out there in immunity credentials. If as part of reopening, right, we're going to require things like proving you've had, when the vaccines are available, access to the vaccines, perhaps even a history of having tested positive and then negative, or have an antibodies test in order to do things like get on a plane or go back to work in certain health critical kind of fields. Having a passport, a way to prove that is something that people are arguing is pretty important. I'm not going to argue whether it's important or not. What I will argue is that if it's built the old bad way as a centralized directory, you can basically say goodbye to privacy, not only for who has tested positive or not, which might be sensitive in many ways, but where people are presenting those credentials, right? In the same way that if you present, you log into, you connect to a site and you're logged into Facebook, and Facebook has a tag, a small image on that, or a Facebook login on that website, Facebook already knows that you're visiting that website, right? That kind of pervasive surveillance is something we should try to mitigate, if not even remove. This approach to credentials is privacy preserving, it's consent oriented, and it avoids that kind of super cookie problem where the issuers of credentials know everywhere that you go. So there's an effort organized now called the Kovat Credentials Initiative, where it's the builders in this space kind of working together to figure out how do we build this in the right way, in a standardized way, work with the health authorities and the governance models around the issuance of these certificates, but also make sure that the plumbing is there. And it does seem like these underlying technologies that have come out of this space, or something called verifiable credentials and DIDs, distributed identifiers, have real play in that space. And it seems that most of the deployments of the self-sovereign ID, user-centric ID, use a blockchain as at the very least, as a distributed key management system, but potentially as well as a place to record hashes and basically timestamps of the documents that have been issued. Again, to allow for increased integrity checks of these documents, and that's really powerful. I mean, if we can get a system out there in time that protects people's privacy while still allowing them to go back to work, and allowing us to get think of this, perhaps put the immunity credentials and the antibodies test stuff aside. Just think about, there'll be a period of time of probably a year before the vaccine is pervasively available to everybody who needs it to get to herd immunity, we'll want to be able to do things like reopen schools. Schools today already require immunizations, in most schools do at least, for many of the common kind of diseases. How do we get that to be efficient and quick and not bureaucratic and not require a lot of presenting of pieces of paper with stamps on them, or doctor signatures or other things that are hard to verify and hard to do at a distance, which is still going to be essential, I think, to how we operate until the vaccine is pervasive. How might we make that work? And on that line, there's other people looking at can we use these similar digital credentials, backed with blockchain technology, to not just help individuals go back to work, but help businesses get restarted as well? Over the last few years, last year, one of the biggest deployments of some of the stuff we built at Hyperledger around digital identity has been by the government of British Columbia for an initiative called the Org Book, which sounds a little weird, but it's basically the establishment of self-sovereign ID for the registration of businesses in the British Columbian government, so that you from a wallet, you can present these credentials when you are applying for a license to serve alcohol because you're a restaurant, right? Which might be a different agency than when you are trying to pay your business registration fees, which or trying to go and get a permit for construction, right? But being able to present these permits across these different agencies and have the individual business and the business owner be the point of integration and the pivot point between all these different actions is a much different and much better, frankly, way of wiring together digital infrastructure between businesses and government than anything that centralizes it on a single agency or even a single state government, right? Because often these agencies are at different tiers, state, local, or even federal. So they are not only expanding that project, but doing looking at implementing a system called Safe Entry BC in a prototype around all the types of operations that you're going to need to certify businesses that they can re-enter and reopen. Whether that's making sure if you're a restaurant that you're spacing people appropriately distant, or if you are want to have payroll issues for staff that you furloughed, being able to move all of those kinds of engagements to be digital, to be something where you don't have to wait 12 hours for an overburdened support staff at a state agency to answer a simple question, or to get a process signed off, where you don't need notaries and signatures and stamps and other kind of face-to-face ways that we prove trust and prove integrity when we engage in these kinds of transactions between business and government. If that all can be optimized, digitalized, while still guaranteeing trust and still guaranteeing confidence in that the system works, that would do a lot to reopen government more and more quickly. Finally, there's an effort called mepasa.org, which is focused on something a bit more generalized, saying there's all these data sources out there about the spread of COVID, all these data sources around supply chain traceability issues and verification issues. We're never going to integrate these all into one backbone or one network, but can we find a way to at least collect the metadata about these information sources, the normalization required between them, in a way to make that provable and trustworthy, that doesn't centralize that on a single big website, on something like Google running a big clearinghouse for that, or Amazon running a big clearinghouse. And so mepasa.org is a collaboration between a bunch of different companies in the blockchain space, as well as small and large, as well as the WHO and a number of public health authorities, to try to sort these issues out. A lot of education going on, a lot of learning curves to be climbed. But it is all based on open source software, and it is all based on blockchain technology. And there's a lot of folks really optimistic about this solving some deep problems. So that's a very quick tour. I know I mentioned a lot of different projects. All of them are very easily Googleable. There are different efforts at different stages, but it's certainly not a good time for any of us, kind of emotionally, physically, whatever. But for these technologies, for these movements, this is a time for them to really stand and deliver, because there's some real ways to have an outsized impact. So with that, I'm going to pivot over to looking at questions in the Q&A. And if Alex or Sebastian or anybody wanted to jump in with some questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much, Brian, for this. I guess, so we have a few questions. I'll start with mine so that I can let people ask their questions. So as you said at the end of your talk, there's a lot of optimism towards blockchain. I am definitely one of the optimists. My career has been revolving around Ethereum mainnet. And actually, I want you to touch on your point about like private blockchain, public blockchains, which I mean, like at most for you, permission blockchains and the transition, because I really believe there will be a transition. And actually, EY and Consensus just announced a baseline protocol, which would be great for enterprises and businesses to switch from permission blockchains to the Ethereum mainnet, maybe with privacy related, or maybe it will be scalable because, you know, transactions are still expensive. What are your views on this? I see maybe you're against it. I would love to get your opinion because I'm not as well versed into permission and enterprise and Hyperledger solutions than you are. So I would love to get your input there.
Sure. So, so there's some very real needs that drive the demand for permission blockchain systems. And a permission blockchain system, by the way, doesn't have to mean private. These are kind of two separate things. But you know, let's talk about, for example, the domain name system, right? Putting aside blockchain just for a second, the domain name system is a cooperative network, lightly coordinated by ICANN, right? That kind of sets the terms for domain name registrars. And anybody can start a domain name registrar. They enter into a contract with ICANN, and then you can start registering domain names. And you have to agree to a set of legal principles and technical principles in order to be a part of that system, right? And that system works with this very lightweight kind of governance that ICANN establishes, but it guarantees, for example, that your domain name that you register, it can move from one registrar to another. And also, if you have a trademark and someone else registers a trademark in your name, there's an adjudication process for sorting that out, right? So those processes, I know there's a lot of public blockchain proposed alternatives for how the domain name system works, but none of them can frankly deal with this need for adjudication and human governance that you have in the domain name system. Permission blockchains are a bit more organized around that. They're a bit more, and yes, you could model that with a lot of sophisticated programming on top of an open, kind of the public blockchains. But the permission blockchains allow you to say, here's the network of known entities. You don't care so much about anonymous participants. You don't really care so much about, you know, you certainly don't care about free markets for the floating cost of writing transactions to the network, that sort of thing. You actually are happy fixing the costs of at least the baseline for publishing data into this network. And so what you're trying to do is get a higher order thing accomplished than trade tokens, right? And so that kind of thing, you know, that model of kind of a mix of algorithmic governance and human governance is what blockchains are really good at implementing. It's conceivable you could re-implement the today's domain name system as a permission blockchain and actually have all the governance niceness you'd like, and a lot more efficiency in the course of doing that, a lot more auditability in the course of doing that. And whether it's the need to follow GDPR rules, you know, it's always a good idea not to publish personally identifiable information to a blockchain anyways, whether private or public. But at least on a permission blockchain, if something was written incorrectly, you have a very clear human governance model around pulling that back and being able to do a hard fork to purge that data as a last resort. It'd be much harder to do that on a public blockchain network. And then finally, there's a real world of certain data residency requirements and really just a default bias towards conservatism when dealing with things like medical records, right? That still suggests that even with great cryptography and great smart contract systems, there's still a risk that you don't have when you have a more controlled environment. There are some people who've likened it to training wheels, that people will start on a permission blockchain and then move to the public blockchain as they get more confidence. I think there's some use cases for which that might be true. I think there's also people who've compared it to VPNs. But that argument is actually not an argument against permission blockchains, because not only do we have VPNs these days, no one reasonably argues against removing them, right? Because every additional layer of security can create an obstacle, but it also, there's a principle that says good security is implemented in layers, right? It's a belt and suspenders approach to things. I do think using public blockchains as a way to do a kind of coordinate communication between permission blockchains is interesting. At the very least, fence posting hashes at the tip of the tree of private blockchains, the public ones make sense. But there's a lot of people for whom the speculative nature of the public blockchains as envisioned today is an issue. And I think when we see central bank digital currency start to emerge, most of which will not use public blockchains as the way of transmitting or storing value, I think you'll see a lot of the cross blockchain needs for moving money between different networks met by those networks. So I don't know. I think this jury is still out. But look, I also believe there's a big role for permission blockchains to play as the roles emerge. I actually just did a talk 2 nights ago with Joe Lubin to our community. Consensus is a major part of Hyperledger. We think it is a spectrum, but there will always be needs for both ends of that spectrum.
Awesome. I think Sebastian has a question.
Brian, hey, good to see you. So bringing it back to the context of COVID-19, and I appreciate all of your thoughts and insights here, but bringing it back to the context of COVID, I personally think that blockchain is in the sort of progression of maturity of technologies, across the board, whether it's public or permissioned or private or whatever, that blockchain is actually quite immature as a technology. And the use cases are also at a very early stage, even though we've seen like tremendous growth in DeFi and in use of permission blockchains. How do you think that this particular crisis may accelerate some of these applications on either side, or like permissioned and non-permissioned, or somewhere in the middle with some of these hybrid models? How do you think that that this particular crisis might accelerate some actual use cases and like actual things being implemented?
Yeah, so I certainly think if you think of this like a stack, that where the lower level of the stack is the plumbing, and the higher level of the stack are the end users, the consumers in particular, that we have a pretty good story on the lower end of the stack. You see networks today, permission blockchain networks like the Food Trust Network, which was largely around food safety. This Trust Your Supplier network, as I mentioned. A lot of other deployments, whether a Fabric or even permissioned versions of Ethereum, like the IIN, which is a quorum-based network that JP Morgan runs. These are seeing real traction, real performance, real use cases and needs. That I think is ready for a tremendous amount of scale, and I think you'll see organizations that might have been hesitant to jump onto that because they could still operate in the old way actually have to move on to those, because that's where the activity is going to be, especially if these are critical to the path of sorting out solid sources of PPEs, or tracking supplies of vaccine as they get out there. And they're, in fact, in the pharmaceutical supply chain space, there's a number of projects that will launch soon that are directly speak to the efficacy of this, and probably the urgency to it as well. Where I'm more concerned is on the end user experience. And for many of the kind of enterprise deployments of this technology, end users don't even really know. Their product shows up at their door that they ordered online, right? But around digital identity in particular, I think this idea of identity wallets, whether that comes to you from your current cryptocurrency wallet, or whether it's something that Apple Pay and Google Wallet and these other kind of native to the platform types of wallet systems embody, or it's something from a startup, we're going to start to see people understand, okay, this is what an identity credentials wallet is about, and this is why having one is a good idea. This is why I could trust it. That's where I think there'll be a lot more movement than we would have perhaps otherwise seen. And those technologies, again, the plumbing is ready, in my opinion, and the way that credentials get issued and that sort of thing. And the industry types are working together on going further up that stack. The last mile, that end user experience is something that I still don't have a lot of clarity around. But I'm hoping, that we get that soon, at least in the use case of presenting, vaccine records and verifiable credentials.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, actually, we have a related question in the Q&A about how blockchain technology. So the question reads: blockchain technology today, is it capable of scaling in a decentralized and open way to the level needed to support the various initiatives you've mentioned, for example, contact tracing?
Yeah. Well, the public and private blockchains have very different stories around scalability. I've followed the Ethereum 2.0 efforts pretty closely, and those will provide a lot more scalability than you see today on the Ethereum network. On permission blockchains, you do see some of the production networks today supporting hundreds of transactions per second, and theoretically into the thousands of transactions per second. By way of reference, right, the Visa network on an ordinary day sees 20,000 transactions per second. Scalability, though, is a little bit of a red herring. If you design your application right and you design the information system right, you can fit everything you need to, I think, within whatever window you're given. You're gonna have to make trade-offs in other ways, but you don't need to put every person who's being tracked by contact tracing as a data item on a blockchain. You don't need to, for contact tracing in particular, I actually would hesitate to say that there's a serious blockchain role to play. I do believe there's a serious open source software role to play in bridging that gap between what Google and Apple have presented with their APIs and the end user experience. There's also a need, by the way, for open source software on the public health authority side to track these, to ingest kind of these reports and understand, okay, here are the people who are self-quarantining, here are the people who've now tested, to effectively manage that as a public health authority will require a whole sector of software that really has been underinvested in and underfunded. And a faster way to get there and lift all boats might be through an open source coordinated approach on that. There are conversations happening along those lines now. But you use a blockchain when you want to prove something, when you want to verify something, when you need, so for supply chains, that is much more important. The pharma supply chain projects that I see coming down the pipe, I are definitely anticipating they've got to fit all of this into a certain window of how many transactions per second or per day, that sort of thing. It's less sensitive to the need to have to confirm a transaction immediately or within 45 minutes or whatever that you might when you're trading cryptocurrencies. And it's possible to squeeze a whole pallet's worth of IDs into one hashed ID and just register that, right, as a single kind of event on a blockchain. Yeah, these are design time constraints that everyone's going to have to work out. There's no brick wall that I see, though. There's no fundamental kind of barrier. This is about helping, about architects and engineers working together to figure out how to work within constraints. But none of those constraints that I've seen suggest that any of the use cases are impossible.
Awesome. And yeah, actually, touching on your point about private permission versus public blockchains, it's both worlds can actually cohabit. Actually, central bank digital currencies like China, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Chinese central bank issued like a digital currency on a permission private blockchains, and they did say that for international transfers, they would need a permissionless public ledger. And so this is why I think outside of their realm, there's Ethereum as a settlement layer. I think this is what I saw last week.
Okay, I hadn't seen that. I mean, it's not even clear whether the Chinese central bank currency, digital currency, uses or even needs a blockchain in the first place. Yeah. What a Chinese central bank digital currency is basically China doing what, to this point, they've been happy to let Alibaba and Baidu do, which is have, WePay and Alipay, Tencent and Alibaba do, which is WePay and Alipay as built-in parts of their app. I think to some degree they wanted a public option as an alternative to that, which is, individual accounts at essentially a state bank. And, you don't really need a blockchain to implement that. You do need a blockchain when you're doing movements between banks. And in fact, in the United States, we have a Federal Reserve that is not one bank institution, that's centralized the way it is in China. It's actually 12, is it, or 13 or 15 regional Federal Reserves who all have to collectively agree when they want to raise the rate or lower the rate. But they all have different assets and they all wire money to each other. And to the top tier banks as well that they backstop. So using a distributed ledger as a real-time gross settlement system between banks is a very different beast than a consumer level kind of thing. And all of the research going in now into RTGSs between banks as a path to a digital dollar or a digital euro or digital krona in Sweden, all of that has been with permission blockchain systems that I'm aware of. There's a strong hesitancy towards proof of work, amongst those parties. Hesitancy towards even proof of authority type models. Proof of what's the other one I'm trying to think of?
Proof of stake.
Proof of stake. Sorry, I was thinking proof of scale. I knew that was wrong. Proof of stake. I just that's such a different model than how the regulators are used to working and the banks are used to working. It's not necessarily my objective to talk them into proof of work, and I'm not even sure it provides strategic value to them at that point. The global picture, the international, what's the unit of trade globally? The role that the dollar has played so far. I don't think there's many people saying that that's going to disappear anytime soon. It's one reason why there is research going into a digital dollar initiative. Giancarlo and David Treat at Accenture, along with research the Federal Reserve has been doing for years, actually, on how to do these kinds of things, I think means that it won't be the first, but it'll certainly be ready in time. But it will be a more multipolar world we're heading into anyways. So the euro and the yuan will have a big role to play in those. I'm just not sure we'll see, if the ETH as a global reserve currency in any reasonable future. Sad to say.
Okay.
For the few ETH that I own, it'd be certainly a great outcome too. But
okay, cool. Thank you very much. Wrapping up now. Thanks a lot, Brian, for coming. Switching